Greetings and welcome to this Eigenverse podcast. I am Samson.
And I am Nate.
And we are going to guide you through the history of video games in a brief history of real-time. This is where we talk about the history from the very beginning of real-time rendered interactive entertainment applications, commonly known by the layman as video games.
So in this series, Hamson is going to go through all the complicated history and things. I don't really know too much about all this, so he's going to be sort of playing the role of telling me this, and I'm going to be in awe of his amazing intellect while I sort of guess at what the common folk might think. I know a bit about all this history, but I didn't really get into gaming until late in the game, and pun intended. So it'll be an interesting perspective.
Yes. Nate got into the video game industry. Well, he started playing video games in, I believe, the N64 era, yes?
Yeah. I had played a couple of NES games at my friend's house, but the first console I had was the N64.
Yeah.
And I didn't necessarily fall in love with gaming in the N64. I was relatively ambivalent about it. I played Majora's Mask, and that was the first game I really owned and played, and it was a very strange game. I was a bit confused, and I was like, oh, so this is what video games are. Interesting. And then I never played anything like it again. I was very confused. But I really got into gaming way later in the sort of PS2 JRPG era, and that's when I started to really fall in love with it.
Yeah. Me, on the other hand, I've been playing video games since I was negative 17 years old, which is where we're going to start. This episode of History of Real Time is called Before the Beginning. And what is the beginning, in my opinion? The beginning is the invention of the microprocessor, or the use of the microprocessor in home video game consoles. I think that's a good mark. And as you might guess, the real beginning then is the Atari 2600 VCS, video computer system, which released in 1979. But like most things, it's not just cut and dry where this is the beginning and everything came after. It has a very murky, mysterious past that led up to that. And you really can't understand where video games came from, or where the computer came from, or where anything that you compute on, whether it's your smartphone or your TV or whatever. You can't understand that until you understand what happened before the beginning.
So I think most people, when they think of Atari, they think of Pong, and they assume that's the very beginning. Are they wrong? Are they actually murky?
That is a good answer. If you had to pick one point, which was the invention of video games, Pong would probably be the best one. Now, really, is that the ultimate beginning? In my opinion, video games were invented sometime shortly after the Big Bang. And but, I can explain that later. We won't get metaphysical at the beginning here.
That's for episode 100. And when run out of material, start scraping for really weird stuff.
Right. I mean, it wouldn't be Eigenverse without that, but that can wait. For now, let's fast forward a little bit ahead of the Big Bang to maybe the 1960s, when... Well, really, I mean, the invention of the computer, which was in the 30s and 40s, mostly the 40s, around World War II. Some of the first computer games, some of the first computer programs would be something that would, like, read a chessboard and say, pawn to D4 or whatever. Is that a computer game? It's certainly not a video game, right? Because it doesn't have a video display. TVs were around then, but people could never figure out how to hook up a TV to a computer, because computers weren't fast enough to keep up with the frame rate of a television. Eventually, in the 60s, they started making these sort of high-resolution displays to display the output of these big, analog computers. And then a couple people got it in their heads that these games were so much fun. By the way, the first video games in the 60s were just a bunch of random lines and dots rendered on various displays that looked like a giant circular portal on the floor.
And would you say that you were talking about the technology wasn't good enough? Do you think this sort of video game in the back of people's minds was a driving force, or was it sort of just a coincidence that, okay, now we can start displaying these pixels and let's take advantage of that? Or were people specifically saying, I want to display these pixels on this, let's make this happen?
Yeah, well, that's probably, yeah, I mean, like a lot of things, and I believe we were just discussing this the other day about whether or not you should build something because it's important or whether or not you should build something because it's cool.
Yeah.
So obviously, the government poured $1 billion, the American government, for example, poured $1 billion into making a computer because it was to beat the Germans in 1940s. That was their excuse. But a lot of people just thought computers were cool. I mean, people saw the first computers as robots and artificial intelligences and just thought, their minds were exploding with the possibilities. Already there were films being made in the 30s and 40s about robots. And when people thought, we could use computers as a source of fun, I think that's what really inspired people to keep going.
Yeah, because most likely, most people would say that the origin of the computer was most likely during World War II with like the Enigma machine.
Yes,
and then I'm not sure if when the invention of radar was a thing, but that had some sort of
that was also World War II.
Yeah,
yes.
so both those
like targeting computer.
Yeah, you can almost see somebody combining the ideas of solving things and displaying these pixels. And
in fact, that is a very good point because I'm going to need to look this up, but the first video game that I've seen that looked like a video game was this thing that you put on the floor. It was like a circle and it had all these lines and dots on it. And the creator of it explained that this was a spaceship battle. Mm-hmm. He had to explain it because it didn't look like that, but that's what it was supposed to be. And undoubtedly that was inspired by the targeting computers that were on these fighter jets.
Yeah.
Just thought, let's fight an imaginary jet. But
it makes sense thinking about some of those really old games with you have your little diamond as a plane and the little blips.
Yeah.
It would make sense that you could find some inspiration from sort of the old radar-y, war things, because that's the only thing they would have seen that was actually purely visual information.
Yeah.
So that was the reference point of what things should look like.
Right.
That was kind of the only thing that looked like that.
Right. And so, but this was just this noisy little box on the floor of a laboratory in MIT. Not many people got to experience this, but in the 60s, a couple people got the idea that this needs to be in every house. So two companies were formed in secret. And they developed, and fast forward to 1972, where we get to the origin, as I was describing it, and as you guessed, Pong. And there were two things in this Pong era. Let's call it the Pong era, starting in 1972, lasting till 1970, 78, 79. And these were, one was Pong by Atari. And it was an arcade cabinet, and you controlled it with the paddle controllers, so called because you were controlling the paddles in what was supposed to represent ping pong.
Yeah.
And these were dials that you turned in order to move the paddles up and down. And there were some other elements to this. You had the two paddles that the two players could control. So the first video game essentially was actually two-playered, multiplayered. And then it had a ball, which was the thing that bounced around. And then it had a score display.
That's pretty interesting thinking about the very first video game being two-player and score, and sort of setting the tone for the rest of video games forever.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, it doesn't have a score? Oh, that's not a video game.
Yeah.
Every video game ever made has had a score. All one of them.
Yeah, exactly. But there was another thing that released at the same time to complicate these things, which was, believe it or not, the first home video game console. The Magnavox Odyssey. Unfortunately, the glorious history of both of these was somewhat marred by a series of lawsuits, as you can imagine, between Magnavox and Atari. But it's really interesting to think that in 1972, you got the two, you wonder which came first, arcades or home video game consoles. Both simultaneously. What's particularly interesting is that the video game console preceded the home computer.
Wow. It's very interesting. I've heard of a lot of situations of this sort of thing where even not video games, if I am remembering correctly, even things like calculus where I'm not sure if it was some sort of math things where two people on the entirely different sides of the world magically came up with the exact same conclusion.
Yeah.
And it was impossible for them to rip off one another. And it's hard to say who came up with who.
Yeah.
And it's just very confusing.
Although this was somewhat different because the guy who made Pong for Atari did work for Magnavox at one point.
Oh, that does make it
that makes it a little dicier. Yeah.
And I think, history will say at least Atari won out for the name recognition.
Yes.
Nobody's really heard of a Magnavox before.
Yeah. Well, nobody in the past 40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I'm okay with giving all the credit to Atari is because of the follow through. Because Atari didn't stop at Pong. That's for sure. The Magnavox had a few games on it. One of which was a table tennis, essentially a Pong. They were both pretty much the same here, where they had pretty much nothing in the way of graphics or audio. And the most important thing to note here is they didn't have microprocessors. They didn't really have computers in the sense of what you think of. They had to build the computer from scratch using every individual gate, every individual piece of logic, individually, stitch them together and kind of hope it works for both of these things. And the parts were so hard to come by back then that from every one built would have been a different model than the previous. Yeah. That
definitely sounds like a recipe for disaster. I'm sure it was expensive in that time, and if one little part went wrong, it was just the whole thing's ruined.
Yeah,
because you can't really replace any parts, and it was such a foreign thing. Nobody would obviously know how to replace it themselves.
Yeah,
I would think.
It's amazing how low they did keep the price, but that's why all you had was these giant white blocks floating around on a black screen. And
you did say they didn't have audio. Is that true for the Atari?
Atari Pong did have audio. What they did was they slipped in parts from pinball machines.
Oh, that makes sense, because I think when you think of the Pong, you're the boop, boop, boop.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's almost more iconic than anything else. The little sound of the ball hitting the paddles really sold it as something's actually happening.
So the Magnavox, unfortunately, did not have any audio. It was silent. And so that was possibly one of the deadly blows that Atari landed on.
We've discussed how important audio is, whether it be sound effects or music for a video game. Even back then, there was, of course, several factors, but I actually do feel like that could have been a big thing. Yeah. Of not having those satisfying sounds. Yeah. And when you think of going to an arcade, you think of all the just loud sounds, whether it be the old pinball arcades where they had those, pings, or the more, a bit more modern arcades where they have all the 8-bit chiptune, sound effects. Yeah. It's become so iconic and ingrained with video games. Yes. Where if you're lacking that, then you're just like a silent film.
Yeah, exactly. You're obviously not. You're obviously just a relic of the past from the moment you're made. Yeah. So with that in mind, Atari didn't really know what to do next, so they made obviously a bunch of different versions of Pong. They made Pong 2 and whatever. The one of the biggest innovations in terms of the Pong universe was Breakout. This was a sort of solitaire Pong made in, I believe, 74 to 76. I'll look this up. But basically this was a sort of solitaire Pong where you played against a wall of bricks. Mm-hmm. And the bricks go from, was it blue to green to red to dead. Yeah. And you see that in all sorts of video games echoed now. And you just try to keep breaking all the bricks without dropping the ball.
It's interesting thinking about Breakout. And I imagine it was probably a lot different from Pong at the time, where you have this idea of, in Pong, you have the ball get past the screen and then all of a sudden a 1 appears. But in that, I feel like Breakout really feels like you're interacting with something. Even though it's entirely virtual, it really feels like you're interacting with a wall and you're having an effect. And you're saying, I'm moving this paddle, and it's having an actual effect in this world. Yeah. And I think that was probably a big moment for it. It's a lot better than just a 1 appearing. Yeah.
In a way, you're playing against the computer rather than playing against another player, which almost makes it feel almost more like a computer game. and something of a one-player adventure to beat this computer. By the way, it was 1976, and here's the crazy thing about this. And if you haven't understood yet why this podcast matters to you and matters to the world here, and why the history of video games is important, maybe this will elucidate it for you. Do you know who built Breakout?
I can squint really hard to see the. No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Who invented that?
It was Steve Wozniak.
Oh, yes.
Assisted by a certain Steve Jobs.
Well, that's very interesting. I do not think most people would think of Steve Wozniak and Apple and all that kind of stuff with video games. Mm-hmm. Especially nowadays.
Yes, exactly. Considering they do not make video games, and they seem to try to keep pushing video games out of their product line, other than, of course, the iOS games, which are their own platform industry. But yeah, they indeed started off making a piece of software slash hardware. There was no difference between hardware and software back then, but for Atari in the summer of '76. This was often considered the breakout game for Atari. This was the point where Atari became the behemoth that just nobody could compete with. Atari rode this wave to start releasing a flurry of games in different genres. And the one other game that you really need to understand now, before we can start talking about the beginning, was called Tank.
Yeah, that one's I think not nearly as famous as Pong.
Yeah,
but people have sort of, I think, heard about it and recognize it, or if they seen the pictures of the little. I think it's just a square with a little line in it. I don't remember too much, but it's at least something that people can think of back in the old days. Another thing is reminiscent of, I was talking before of the idea of radar and all this kind of stuff. It started off with sport type things with Pong, and then pretty fast seems like it went to combat and action and destruction and whatnot, where thinking about violence in video games, you can say even back in this time, if one of the earliest video games was about controlling a tank and bringing down another tank, I mean, that is pretty intense for the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about, what was going on at this time, this was sort of circa the Vietnam War, when war and peace were all anybody was talking about. Obviously, in the heat of the Cold War at the same time. As we've been talking about, people like violence.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about where it came at a time where we currently always think of video games as almost an escapism, and I do wonder how people did feel about constantly being surrounded by war and the thought of nuclear fallout with the Cold War and everything like that. And if they found the idea of, I'm prepping my skills with using a tank to be comforting, or if it was just, this is the same old, having controlling a tank, it's old news compared, where that's just the life we live in. So of course this would be the video game.
Yeah, I guess thinking about it, if the video game Tank means anything, it means that we like violence as long as we win. Yeah. So I got an image up here of Tank. Anything come to mind looking at that?
Well, it looks like Tetris.
It almost does, right?
All those little barricades making the squares and everything like that. But it does sort of remind me of a lot of different things like Pac-Man and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Just the idea of obstacles.
Exactly. The idea of stage geometry, right?
Yeah.
So this was something that obviously doesn't exist in Pong. But basically you had to move around these obstacles using the infamous tank controls, which people still refer to, of turning and going forward rather than going in a particular direction. You had to navigate around these obstacles, find the enemy tank, and blast them. And I do wonder one thing about the tank controls
is do you think they were like that, where you had to sort of do one motion and another motion because that's how tanks work, or do you think there was an actual limitation where it couldn't read like the two directions at once?
Well, I don't think it had a proper joystick on. And actually, looking at this advertisement here for it, they describe it as realistic tank controls.
It was probably like a selling point that it felt like you were really driving a tank.
Yeah, exactly. The slight difficulty made you think, well, I mean, it would be difficult to drive a tank.
Yeah. There's a lot of situations where it's hard to tell if it's a feature or a bug. You know? So of course they're going to call it realistic tank controls. You won't believe, but But I am curious to see if it was brought about by some sort of limitation, or if they fully intended all the time to really have that feel.
Yeah.
Either way, it really did have an impact on controls for a long time.
Yeah.
So obviously people must have liked something about
racing controls. I mean, there's plenty of games with video games, with vehicles now. If you think about it, a car has the same controls. It's just the camera rotates along with it. The only reason it's awkward in tank is because you're looking at the tank from an overview. Trying to think of it, I think they had the ability to move it in whatever direction you wanted to go. They seem to have some concept of a velocity vector. Okay. If you think about Pong. Yeah. I mean, the ball sort of follows its velocity vector and its own sort of laws of physics. But anyway, so now we have the concept. Think about Pong. You got the two paddles, you got the ball. And in Tank, you had one missile for each player. Mm-hmm. So you had the player one paddle, the player two paddle, the player one missile, the player two missile, and the ball. And believe it or not, this became the formula for what I call the beginning, was the Atari video computer system, where those 5 elements were hard-coded into the CPU. So everything that you see, and there's also the stage geometry that we mentioned, these blocks. So everything in Atari was considered one of those 6 things, essentially.
Yeah. You could think of people coming across Tank and thinking, oh, I can think of how to do something slight difference. And then if you really think about, what's a missile and everything just with one velocity, you think, think of the limitless possibilities of just using a permutation of all these different things. Yeah. And you could totally get how they were like, okay, this is what it is. And everything's going to be some sort of variation of this for even just convenience sake.
And the point of these podcasts from us here at Eigenverse is we'll give you a developer's perspective. And thinking about it here, this would be a fun little exercise. Let's think of some video game that we don't think has been made yet, and let's see if we can redescribe it in terms of those five elements. What would be the missile? What would be the ball? So, what's a sport or a form of combat or something that you don't think has been made yet?
As a video game?
Yeah.
I think every real life thing has been made into a video game at this point.
Let's say anteaters who need to eat a bunch of ants. 2 competing anteaters who can eat the most ants. Okay. All right. How would you describe every element in a gameplay scenario? Picturing you view it from an overview. You view the area in a big overview. You control the 2 anteaters, move it around, and eat the ants. How would you do that with only 5 elements?
So I would think the ants themselves would almost be like the missiles, where there would only be, I think you'd be limited by the amount of ants that could be on the screen at all the times. But those would be the sort of objective things that would interact with the players, where it'd be essentially, instead of the missile, the missile hitting your player, it would be you running into the missile, and the missiles would be the ants. And instead of blowing up, you'd get +1 ant points.
Right. Yes, that's what I was thinking too. Not sure what the ball would be. I guess we could just make the ball another ant. But maybe that would be like a super ant.
Yeah.
That would be like a +2 ant.
Well, you have to have the queen ant.
Yeah, the queen ant. Yes, the queen ant would be the ball, and it would keep spawning these missiles.
Yeah.
And you want to like not eat the queen ant because then you're out of food. That would be a pretty good one. And using that technique, you could only render, of course, 2 ants at a time, or could you? So now we're also getting into another important feature of. All right, so let's say we wanted more ants, but we only have 2 sprites left.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we got to have one. One is the anteater. One is the player 1 anteater. One is the player 2 anteater, and then you have a player 1 ant and a player 2 ant for whatever that is. Doesn't matter which player eats it, but how do you get another ant? So what does something need to be in order to exist in a video game? When you think about it, how would you say, like, what does this tank need to do in order to exist on this video game?
The biggest thing I would say is just it needs to exist, so it needs to be displayed.
Yes, it needs to be displayed, and hypothetically, there needs to be some data point somewhere in here that's saying where it is.
Yeah,
its location vector, right?
In information, and so some sort of information and a display of that, a visual representation of that information.
Right. So here's the thing. The player 2 missile can only exist in one point in space at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm.
But what if you think of like, I'm going off on a crazy tangent at this point, but in quantum mechanics, sometimes a particle can exist in one spot, and then it can really quickly move over to another spot, and then it can really quickly move back, and then just go back and forth so fast that it looks like it's in 2 places at once.
Yes. This analogy is lost on probably 95% or 99% of our audience, but
yes.
for us too, at least this would actually make some sense.
Yes. So suffice to say that, missile ants work exactly the same way as quantum mechanical particles. You can move one from one spot to another really, really fast and then move it back and it'll still work. Why? It's because the different points on a screen back in the day were displayed at different points in time. So let's put ourselves back in our 1970s shoes and say, what type of display are we working with here? I'm not entirely sure if the original like Pong even used like a CRT screen, but at this point with Tank and all that, we're talking about CRT screens.
Yeah.
What's a CRT screen? How does it work? Unfortunately, I don't know how to explain this without using quantum mechanics, but basically it's a laser beam that zips across the screen a whole bunch.
Yeah.
And it goes from just the way you read a book. It goes from top left to the top right, and then goes down a notch and goes left to right. And they're called scan lines.
One common analogy might be, correct me if this is a terrible one, but almost like dominoes. So you have a set of dominoes, and then you flick one, and then it sort of triggers all the rest of the dominoes down a zigzag line, and then it sort of resets itself at the end. Yeah. And then it kind of keeps re-triggering. So it's in a little line of triggering these, I'm assuming they're lights or something.
Yeah.
Back in CRT.
In a way, if
I don't know exactly what the scan
if the
lines
domino
were.
on the top right was able to suddenly knock over the one on the left of the line below it, that and
I guess that's true.
And also the fact that the dominoes, when you think in terms of pixels, obviously a pixel would be the domino, but the thing is, that's not really how it worked. It was more of a continuous domino. There were no pixels in a scan line. It was an analog number from left to right. The pixels arose because, so let's say you're in the middle of the scan line and you're drawing blue. And then you're like, okay, let's switch to red. And then you're like, okay, let's switch to blue. So you went from from blue to red to blue, somewhere in the middle of the scan line. How long is the red part? How wide is the red part? And what determines how long that would be?
I have no idea.
Well, think of yes. And, obviously nobody really has any idea, but you can say that So the computer switched it from blue to red to blue.
Mhm.
The red is just simply how wide is that red pixel? However long it takes the computer to switch it to red and back. So if these two instructions were right next to each other, then it would be the clock speed of whatever the processor is running on. So basically, that's why back then the pixels weren't square.
Mhm.
They were stretched out quite a bit. I think they were like 3x1 sort of thing. And that's because the scan line, it goes way faster than you can see. It goes what, 250 scan lines all the way down the screen.
Mhm.
It 60 times per second. Yes, all video games back then were 60 FPS.
Oh wow!
There was not a single video game that wasn't 60 FPS in the 70s.
We need to catch up.
We need to catch up to the 70s. Yeah. So at least in the NTSC, North American region, or Japanese region.
Yeah. That makes. I was thinking more along the lines of modern technology, I guess, of the LEDs being the pixels, but
right.
But yeah, CRT is definitely, now that I think about it, definitely different. Where it is a laser shining right on
yes.
those. It's not turning switches on and off.
And I'm not entirely sure how it works in terms of the LED. If I recall correctly, it's a bunch of different branching paths that come off of I believe the term would be parallel circuit, in order to pretty much light up all the lights on an LED whatever screen at the exact same time. But back then, no, there was an order. And it was very fast, but there was an order. And the thing is, in the 70s, computer systems were getting just fast enough that they could keep up with that speed. So one clock tick would be a certain length that you could see on the scan line of the CRT. So what you had to do in order to draw two missile ants, was draw the first missile ant on the top of the screen. Wherever, as the scan line's going along, it'll say, okay, am I near that location where the ant was supposed to be? And you could say, yeah. Okay, switch to whatever color the ant is. Then when it passes that, it's like, am I still there? No. Okay. Switch to whatever color the background is. Keep going. And then keep going down the scan lines and say, okay, we're suddenly going to change our mind. Now we're going to draw low missile ant. So halfway down the screen, we're switching the location of that ant. And then when we get to that location, we draw that ant. And so, yeah.
So it's just tricking it, but our brains and vision can't tell the difference of that lag, right? So it just sees two of them at the same time.
Yeah, ultimately, and in fact, the scan line kind of stays bright for a while. So at a certain point in time, the whole screen is lit up, and there are indeed two ants there at the same time. So it's really not too much to do with our with the limitations of our vision, although that helps.
Yeah.
But it really is, in one frame, you can put one object in two locations at once. By doing this sort of ping pong motion. Then you just have to remember that at the end of the frame, you have to switch back to displaying the first ant you were trying to display. So doing this, it's pretty easy to see how we could have, at least 4 ants on the screen at a time.
And thinking about this, you could see just how important the processing power really was to do something that fast. Because, before so many things, I imagine in those days, you still had the idea of thinking in terms of human capacity for thinking or whatnot.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you have to have this thing of like, obviously, no, it's inhuman to be able to do these two things in that time of span.
Yeah.
And you could see the power of the computer.
Right.
Where it wasn't just solving something over and over in a certain amount of time. It was to get something. It was now almost instantaneous thing.
And this was known among those in the industry back then as racing the beam. Which is a really awesome word or term.
That definitely needs to be a video game. I'm surprised it hasn't been at this point.
One day we'll make a game about making games and it'll be called Racing the Beam. But yeah, unfortunately, all this beam racing was lost on the consumer.
Yeah.
They're just like, oh, they can display one ant. Why can't they display two?
Yeah.
They didn't know, what had to go into this in order to do it.
And that's just typical story of pretty much everything.
Yeah.
They just take it for granted of, oh, I thought of this.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Right.
And don't have to think about all the loops and,
Yes.
and things you have to go through to create the illusion that it's just, oh, I thought of this and there it is.
Yeah, that's really the story of the 70s and 80s in video games here. I thought of it, therefore it's possible. Obviously it's not, but somehow we're going to make it so.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, you had two paddles and two missiles. How do you fill an entire screen with Space Invaders?
Yeah.
You have to, this is, people, everything you did back then had to be a hack.
Yeah.
There was no proper way to do anything.
And it's interesting thinking about that mentality of back then you had so many limitations. So that's why they had to be really creative and think of all these weird things. And nowadays you don't have limitations really. You actually can just think of it and make it.
Yeah.
For the most part. It's obviously not that simple, but we don't have anywhere near the limitations that they used to with modern gaming. But thinking about is that I think is obviously, at the end of the day, it's a much better thing. But I think the people who still say the NES or whatever were the best games of all time because they were so creative, what they really like, I think, is the creativity of all the hacks where they had this thing and they had all these limitations and all these things to go against. But through all of that, they triumphed and made something.
Yes.
Where it's a little bit different of a story nowadays.
Yeah. These days, it's easier to make a hyper realistic first person shooter than it is to make Pong, pretty much.
Yeah, it really, it pretty much is because then you have to go back in the old day and break out the whatever language they were using.
Though there was no language.
Yeah,
they had to. As I said, there was no microprocessor. They had to connect those logic gates.
Yeah. So it was just
It was just the hardware and the software really were one and the same.
So that's definitely the case of can't get anybody to. I'm sure that people would love to do that and spend their time doing that just to say they could, but nobody's going to.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess you could say there was a language. The language was binary.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they already did have sort of these high-level quote programming languages like Fortran, where you could write things that kind of looked like words, and they would end up making something that kind of looked like a logical computer program.
Yeah.
But basically that wasn't a thing in the video game industry, as we'll see over the course of this podcast, until the mid-90s, if that. Basically the 2000s.
So do you have any idea of how they, say, tested these types of things, like Pong? Did they, create this thing and then be like, have to, create this processor, then play it, and they're like, oh, it doesn't do anything, start over from scratch? Or could they do something where it's like, okay, I did this, something appeared, and then do that? Or was it sort of like a blind box situation where they had to do a bunch of things and then
didn't know if it would work until the very end?
Yeah.
It was much more like that than it is today. You did have to do quite a bit. You had to, weld your whole computer together before you could get anything on the screen.
Yeah.
However, people had been making computer systems for quite a while. People knew what in general had to go into a computer logically in order to make it work.
Okay.
People knew that, with a series of what are called NOR gates or AND gates, you could make an entire computer work. If you fed in the right amount of energy and you stored the memory in something, people knew more or less how to get a computer system to work. So after you did that, then I guess you could just get down to, tweaking the way that it connects to the video bit by bit, see if it works. Definitely a lot of trial and error. I mean, there's still a lot of trial and error making a video game today. Yeah. But back then it was, can I get a pixel display here? Or
I'm sure there's a lot of, nowadays even looking at code, you can still copy and paste and see exactly what worked and do trial and error
essentially,
that way.
They were copying and pasting. But by that, I mean they were photographing other computers that other people made.
Yeah.
And then, stitching them together. And here we're talking about the early 70s. as we'll see in 1975, something changed. And that was really the advent of the microprocessor, and in such a form that it could be used in video game systems, and people could afford it. But I won't get ahead of myself. That's definitely an entire episode. In fact, how long have we been going now? 40 minutes. Wow.
So that actually was a really good stopping point.
Yes. So let's just, stop it here. We've gotten to the point where we have advanced technology as far as we could possibly do so without a single powerful chip that anybody can afford and that will fit in your living room. And we'll be able to play basically anything you can think of, and will be able to be hacked by basically any programmer into any shape and form. And we will get to that next time. So I hope you are looking forward to that as much as I am.
Thank you guys so much for listening for this little experiment.
Yes. And yes, hopefully this experiment was a success, and there will be many more to come. Otherwise, congratulations on listening to the one and only very valuable History of Real Time podcast. Thank you very much. And until next time.